far, very competitive tournament, achievement. Okay. My name is Ruben, I'm your chair. With me, paneling is Virat, Daniel, Virat, oh, dude. On the motion about China fucking North Korea and by Prime Minister to begin today's meeting.
This debate will be about China, shall be about China and its goals and its individual outcomes first, especially in light of a problematic ally that the rest of the world doesn't seem to like. We think this ally is also North Korea. We think it's about time that China takes a hard stance and say, we no longer want you as a diplomatic ally as well as an economic ally at the end of the day. The stance that we're willing to have under this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is to tell you that we support China trying to break away from its association from what North Korea actually is in terms of its political ties and economic in that certain sense, right? Three things to talk about in my argumentations. Firstly, why does China have an interest in this? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, how does the tie between North Korea and China look like right now? And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what are the consequences of this model that we have. So let's talk about the first thing. Why is it in China's best interest to cut off all ties with North Korea? We think it's in the best interest for China because you no longer have a country that is associated with you when it comes to North Korea. China, as we know right now, Mr. Speaker, is one that no longer lives under Mao Zedong's rule of communism, right? China has undergone a huge transformation under a very clear goal to make as many friends as possible and to create an amiable climate in order to create more economic ties with other countries on a global scale. That's the key reason as to why China is one of the most biggest economies that is booming within a global market right now. And they want to be this economic powerhouse because that is their clear goal. No, thank you. They are number 2 in the world, Mr. Speaker, for a progressive economy for a reason, right? They want to establish the AIIB. They are currently having talks with America and they have created ports in all different countries in Africa, Mr. Speaker, as a show of soft power or economic ties. And all of this would be very much dependent on the willingness of another country wanting to create an economic and political tie with you. At this point, Mr. Speaker, we attribute China's re-strategization in how people can view what China actually is right now. Sure, they used to be communist, Mr. Speaker, and sure, they have several territorial disputes. But that's why in 1996, China was willing to break away from Russia, Mr. Speaker, because they thought that the Russian tie that they had with the tie that they had with Russia would inherently harm the ties that they wanted to have with America much later on. They built offices in Taiwan as a show of diplomatic relationship, Mr. Speaker. And even then, in 2015, Xi Jinping had talks with America in order to abjure from like having cyber attacks, Mr. Speaker, because they thought it was in their best interest to do so. This is not any different from North Korea. No, thank you. The reason as to how people view the relationship between China and North Korea right now works on two extremes, and I'll tell you what. Firstly, they look at China as being complicit in nature with the relationship as to why North Korea is as hostile as it is, Mr. Speaker. And secondly, they try, and this will probably be a case that they run into that side of the house and say that China is the only peacekeeper with North Korea because North Korea is that one kid who doesn't really have that many friends. Let's talk about the first thing, Mr. Speaker, whether or not China is complicit in what really is happening within North Korea. Given the state of what China is doing right now, Mr. Speaker, in which they reject militarization after a very long time as the end of their clear goals, Mr. Speaker, the prospective argument that a lot of countries try to run right now in terms of wanting to create political ties or economic ties with China is to say, look, We think whatever ties we have with you will benefit North Korea in a way, Mr. Speaker, because of the horrible reputation that you have when it comes to you having a $6.8 billion industry with them that somehow is complicit in allowing all those hydrogen bombs to be created by North Korea at the end of the day. This is problematic, right? No, thank you. Sit down. Because the problem in which people perceive China and the way in which they want to create ties with them is contingent on whether or not people think you will then be complicit in allowing such trade from happening at the end of the day. But the second thing, Mr. Speaker, in them saying that you are perceived as the peacekeeper towards North Korea, right? At this point, this is only a surface level assumption, Mr. Speaker. There is, and we're willing to say in the dissent of the House, no duty whatsoever by China in order to provide a check on North Korea. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we're willing to support a multilateral approach in terms of China joining the rest in the world in trying to keep North Korea in check. Just because they're the only ally doesn't mean they're the only ones who can keep a check on them. Even then, Mr. Speaker, to buttress this example, I'll tell you what. In January, North Korea created a hydrogen bomb which pissed off China, Mr. Speaker, which means that they don't particularly care about what ties they have with China at the end of the day. Before I move on to my second issue, quickly.
If cutting ties with North Korea means that does not accrue the benefits you want, would you also cut ties with Russia and other rogue states in similar positions?
Yes, they have, mate. I just told you my examples, right? Secondly, how does the tie look like with China and North Korea right now? North Korea tends to have this persecution and victim complex that they try to play with the rest of the world, especially with Kim Jong-un at the peak of the throne, Mr. Speaker. There are three huge examples to show you why this is not entirely true. Firstly, I already told you in January they built a hydrogen bomb that pissed off China. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, China agrees with America in order to have sanctions towards North Korea when it comes to economical ties that they have. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, Xi Jinping has inherently rejected how China wants to militarize against North Korea at the end of the day. All of this, Mr. Speaker, in contrast to how North Korea engaged with it, was not constructive in nature, and that's why there's no reason at all for China to still be with North Korea in hopes that this situation will then improve. We're not willing to support something that is stagnating at the end of the day. Thirdly, what are the consequences of what we have? And here's what we buttresses the goals that China has in terms of the economic goals. They don't particularly care about the non-intervention policy, Mr. Speaker, as long as they make as much money as they want. But if China continues this relationship that we have with North Korea right now, this affects international legitimacy that they have in a certain scenario. America tend to have this strain with China in the old days, Mr. Speaker, because they wanted to ally with Russia, in which you wanted to POI me about. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, they attach complicity towards China being allies with North Korea at the end of the day. Especially when it comes to having international legitimacy within the UN Security Council, for example, Mr. Speaker, the reason as to why China has no longer vetoed policies that go against North Korea is because they wanted to see more amiable towards other people wanting to join the AIIB or the rest of their clear goals. Should this and your certain ally, which is North Korea, be something that is a hindrance to your economy, Mr. Speaker? It's about time you said no.
Yeah. Thanks, Speaker, for the speech. To open the case for the opposition bench, I invite the leader of Talk.
China, at the very moment, is clamping down on people's ability to speak freely, congregate for protests and demonstrations, and most recently, the head of a news outlet with an opposing position to the government has been kidnapped. China is not the good guy, and we will not pretend that we are either. The side that government wants to portray is a very, very misleading one. So we're just going to correct some of the misallegations that they have suggested in today's debate. Firstly, they just failed to characterize why North Korea was a bad idea to form relations with China in the first place. They used circular reasoning to justify that, suggesting that China's interest in North Korea was bad simply because it is North Korea. I think we needed a little more characterization there from that side, and that was severely lacking. On this idea of how it would affect relations with the USA, we think that the USA, as well as the global community, is severely dependent on China's economy. And I'm just going to give you a few reasons as to why they will not simply drop all of their interest with China simply because of the relationship with North Korea, as you suggested. Have a seat. Yes, it's true that January, North Korea developed a hydrogen bomb and that China has keen interest within the state. But this doesn't affect China's influence with the rest of the world. Due to economic dependence on Chinese consumer goods, for example, the USA's #1 importer is China. China has been purchasing mines and municipalities in Western Africa, as well as China's most recent AIIB deal with the EU. We think that each of these bodies in the global community are severely dependent on China, and on the singular issue of North Korea, they aren't simply going to drop all of this simply because Xi Jinping is in ties with Kim Jong-un. We think that this is incredibly false. Another misallegation that they wanted to paint was China's dissolving of ties with the Russians. We think that the Sino-Soviet split was something that happened in the 60s and the 70s, and more recently, ties with Russia are closer than ever. We see Putin and Xi Jinping meeting up all the time in Moscow and in Beijing. So we think that for you to allegate that they dissolved ties in 1997 was completely false. Gorbachev, however, is no longer in power and no longer has hostile views against Russia. So what is the state of China today? Firstly, I'm going to outline to you why China should carry out an action, because they do so on 3 main standards. The first is on this idea of morality. The second is how they have an external impact to the rest of the world. And lastly, their influence and strength and how they've been able to consolidate that power. So firstly, why China has no moral obligation. I've stated before, and I'll state it again, that China has no incentive to be the good guy or peacekeeper in your case, meaning the reign in Kim Jong-un, and he has no ability to reform North Korea, and we think that China shouldn't influence his decision to do so. We also think that this motion is in the best interest of China, and we think that at least side government agrees with us in that instance. Make no mistake, their aims and interests revolve around growing their own hegemony as a global economy and a global military power. This has been their goal for dynasties. The tiger does not change his stripes, and neither does Xi Jinping. Next, I'm going to move on to what the reaction of China's allies and the external impact of China's influences are. China represents the Asian interests of the community. China is the only Asian nation in the P5, and so they have a stronghold as representing the greater culture and ability of Asia. If they simply cut their alliance with North Korea, a series of things happen. They lose trust in the regional alliances within Asia. For example, Asian nations ally with China, but even though they're internationally condemned, they do so anyway. We think, have a seat. We think that because of China's unconditional economic aid to countries like Malaysia, to countries like Myanmar, regardless of the atrocities that happen within those countries, it is no different than North Korea. If they simply drop North Korea as an ally, we think that the other nations that are dependent on China will begin to lose trust in them. So we think that they will also fear that they're next on the chopping block. If there is a value, in the unconditional aid that China gives to North Korea and their other Asian allies. Thus, if the aid ceases to flow, we think that cutting the support from other Asian nations completely depreciates the economy of the entire region as a whole. Sure.
Your initial premise was that the entirety of the rest of the community is currently dependent upon China, and China has no incentive to change. So right now, why would they just abandon China just because they think China doesn't like North Korea anymore?
It's not that they're going to abandon China, it's that they have no choice. They fear for their own state of their economy if China suddenly pulls out from an Asian nation nearby. Just simply by proximity, they're going to fear that they're next on the block. Because what are the reasons that China might pull out from North Korea? Is it because of morality? We've already clarified that that is not the case, and therefore it is not in China's best interest to drop out from North Korea. My next point is, where is China's influence and strength drawn from? This comes from 2 main areas. Firstly, their military might and regional security, and secondly, their economic facilities with other countries that are dependent on China. If China pulls out of North Korea, this severely harms the military power. This happens because China does not understand the ability to research and develop military power in North Korea. We think that Kim Jong-un is definitely a megalomaniac, and he will do as much as he can to escalate military power in the region. We think it's even worse if China, have a seat, if China pulls out and Kim Jong-un is seen as an enemy of the state against China. This means that they have one more military enemy in the area, and we think that the proximity is unsafe for the North Koreans as well as unsafe for China. We think regional instability is always going to be a bad idea. It also harms the ability of other Asian nations because this puts the USA in a better position to move into the region. Right now, China is at crossroads in the international community as both superpowers, China and the USA, are fighting to gain clout within the region. We see the USA moving into Taiwan, moving into the Philippines, and regions nearby China. China is also trying to solidify their gains in the South China Sea. This conflict draws greater than North Korea and this issue. We also think that China's alliance with the EU in terms of the economy is severely being challenged by the USA's influence in the TPPA. We think that the regional differences are very severe. And this leads me to my next point, why this doesn't improve Sino-US relations and relations with the rest of the world. The beef that China has with the rest of the world and America draws greater from North Korea. If they pull out of the region, it is tokenistic at best. There's still a numerous amount of reasons why they're still hostile with other reasons. Therefore, the dispute over economic allies and hence gaining regional support, ideological differences are also accumulating factor. That's why we still think that China's decision to pull out of North Korea is a nonsensical one and that hostilities will still occur.
Yeah, I thank the speaker for his speech. To continue the case for the government and apply legal premise.
At this point, we think that opposition was wholly uncomparative in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. Because if you listen to a lot of the things leader of opposition said, it was a contention that we do not want China to pull out because there's a likelihood that North Korea will act like a big baby and act aggressively, ladies and gentlemen, or that United States will come in right now and China loses out. I think there has to be a comparative in this debate as to how does China strategizes itself, given that sometimes you have to make trade-offs in terms of trying to prioritize certain end goals as a collective country rather than trying to fight goals in many different aspects, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to break it down to you and tell you why China's prioritization of economic development is currently at risk when it comes to aligning itself with China, with North Korea. I'm also going to illustrate to you all of the reactions that they were talking about, and I'm going to prove to you why it's necessarily mitigated or tempered. The first thing I'm going to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that at this point, the ability for China to act as an ally to North Korea is merely tokenistic in nature in its perception to the international community. There is a presumption that exists in status quo that China acts as a babysitter to North Korea and therefore tempers all the aggressive reaction that is likely to be cultivated by North Korea. But we don't think this is true. If you're going to assess it on the outcomes, we think you also have to assess the process as well. Whilst we think that China is able to maybe in certain instances mitigate the utilization of nuclear power, for example, the fact that there was an allowance for them to build up nuclear power to begin with was problematic, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that the ability for you to have trade relations that amounted to billions of US dollars signals to the rest of the world that you are complicit in this, that maybe the trade money that is being utilized right now is a very exact money that is being utilized to build up that nuclear weapon, ladies and gentlemen. So at this point, what is in China's best interest? How did the world perceive China in the past? Oftentimes, the world often essentializes China to static characterizations like being an absolute communist state, being a dictator, evil, and kiasu, right? But we think that China has worked hard towards re-strategizing the way they presented themselves to the international community, ladies and gentlemen. At this point, we think that China has put at the forefront and told to the rest of the world that our only goal right now is economic development, whilst it may be stereotypical Chinese people like money and all that, but we think that the economic prosperity that they want to engage at the end of the day has always been their goal. So we think that whilst they are a burgeoning economy and are able to build up certain alliances within Asia, for example, we think it's still isolated in some instances, ladies and gentlemen. For example, the ability for the United States of America to call up participants from Asia to join the TPPA and excluding China illustrates why at some point China will be isolated, ladies and gentlemen. Second level, how do you best cultivate perception, right? And I'm going to argue that this is a form of synergistic management solution, ladies and gentlemen, because we told you in Mukherjee's speech, there is a binary in the way in which people view China right now. Either you are complicit in nature or you are the hero that we need in order to temper this reaction, right? We think the first thing we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is about perspective right now. And we think that when China wants to cultivate an environment for economic development, because the argument that China uses right now is that we are a massive country with finite resources and we are trying very hard to disperse resources to ensure there is an equitable growth all across China. And we think that at a point at which the international community is beleaguered by the fact that there is a relation between you and North Korea, that you are facilitating the process of North Korea building up a dictatorship, often the discussion doesn't traverse to trade relations. Let's acknowledge, building a trade relation with countries often requires another country to want to concede to participating in that relationship. And it requires security and investment as well. I want to be sure that the money that I'm trading with you as a country isn't being capitalized by a rogue state. I want to ensure that me building up banks and businesses and ports in your country does not mean that the resources will go back to building up a militarization area in North Korea. Given that you as a country, Xi Jinping came out in March 2016, make a public statement and said that we are heavily against the militarization that North Korea is engaging upon because it is counterproductive to economic development and building up alliances, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we think that the international community can't make up its mind as to whether or not they want to depend on China and at the same time continuously vilifying China for all the many different things that they do. I'm not going to contest there is a problem with democracy in China right now, but we think there has to be a bridging point between China and the rest of the world. We think that economic development is a prerequisite in people being able to access many different infrastructures that allows for them to access things like education, that allows for them to access things like democracy, ladies and gentlemen. That's why China has been slowly opening up its framework of democracy and allowing people to access things like information, for example, or points of communication all across the world, right? Stop laughing. Lastly, economic development loses out. We think this is a distinction between trade agreements that countries or associations like in European Union and political relations. Oftentimes, we would think that the ability, no thank you, that the ability for people to participate in a relationship has to be on a quid pro quo basis. Right now, people view China maybe as a form of manufacture or where I get my cheaper iPhones, for example, but we don't think they view them as a legitimate political ally, and oftentimes in discussion lumps China up with rogue states and say you are very likely to veto our resolution anyway. Yes. That's why we told you in Mukherjee's speech, the act of China not vetoing a unilateral resolution that the United States proposed in the United Nations Security Council is an important indicator that at this point, China does not want to participate in that relationship anymore, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think the incentive is to want to look good right now. We think that the inability for them to build up this characterization is contingent upon that relationship with North Korea. Before that, yes.
The reason why China is at odds with the rest of the world isn't just North Korea. It's also about their expansionist ideas and the fact that they are strong economic might. How do you achieve their aims by bowing to their economic independence?
The first thing we have to acknowledge, the expansionist policy that you talk about kind of excludes the fact that China has been very agreeable to wanting to come to discussions with things like territorial disputes, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, I'm going to acknowledge this argumentation on Asian countries losing out, right? We think that's not true. Often other Asian countries champion the fact that China is slowly moving away from being a communist and a rogue state. But secondly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, is that oftentimes Asian countries do not build relationships based on the fact that China protects North Korea, but the fact that China is a booming economy, the fact that the currency is a lot cheaper, the fact that there is a large manufacturing processes that allow for them to exist. So even if you distance yourself, we don't think countries immediately say, oh, I'm scared right now and I'm going to jump ship. But the comparative is true on your side. If you're going to say that your money is being used to build hydrogen bombs, that's when Asian countries are less likely to want to stay. But even if they leave, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that that's the debate because it's about China's best interest. Lastly, on the United States, we told you in Mukherjee's speech that China wants to cultivate a working relationship with the United States because it acknowledges that going to an all-out war with the United States is just unstrategic, costly, and not economical, ladies and gentlemen, given that they're trying to prop up economic development in China. And that's why it has very well agreed and acceded and affirmed the sort of policies the United States has talked about, ladies and gentlemen. At this point, the debate has to be a comparison to what sort of strategies do you engage on as a nation state, and we think that China has every interest to do this.
Yes, thank you. Thank the Speaker for speech. To extend the case for the opposition bench and invite the Deputy Leader.
This debate does need a comparative, but it needs to be a comparative of the lesser of two evils when it comes to furthering the economy of China and the unfortunate burden that comes with it. I think there are many clarifications that need to be made in this debate because side government was lying a lot at points in their speech. At the same time, they wanted to be convenient at many points in their speech. So I'll dedicate an entire issue to all those fallacies. But the other two questions would be, firstly, what is the moral position of China? And secondly, economic development and the technical aspects of it. Let's look at the moral positions of China. The Prime Minister tried to illustrate to us that China is creating a more malleable perception that the community is supposedly accepting. Sure, with numerous mysterious killings of journalists, the rejection of rights to Tibetans and individuals within China, I'm sure that they are bastions of human rights, guys, and all these reasons are supposedly fiated the moment we cut all our ties with North Korea. They are not exactly great people. They just reject rights of their own citizens. Those are things that they wouldn't want to take into consideration or did not want to talk about within this debate. Aside from that, let's talk about this babysitter nonsense, right? Because the PM created some supposed logic that the Deputy Prime Minister wanted to rebut. We never said that they were guardians of North Korea. We never agreed with this perception to begin with. Of course, it's wrong. We don't support it. It's not that they are babysitters. It's a two-way process that benefits both of them. It strengthens the military and support of defense for China. At the same time, benefits North Korea as well. They are not pleased with the hydrogen bomb. They just don't want to be victims of that hydrogen bomb. And is that such a wrong incentive to begin with? I don't care if it's a babysitter perception. They are protecting their own independent economy as a whole. Stop creating logic and assuming we support it. Sit down. Will this moral perception change? Because there was a huge link as to not supporting North Korea to apparently many countries supporting China as a whole. They made the link themselves. The US excluded China from the TPP. Many countries only have economic ties with China due to their unconditional aid and unconditional trade requirements, which means that is the be-all end-all for many countries in war to engage with economic ties with China, Myanmar, Malaysia. We have all things to hide. That is the reason why we engage with China, because they don't ask for reforms in return. And that is the only thing that you violate under your paradigm. You remove from countries that are belligerent. You remove from countries that don't comply with your policy. I do not see why countries will hinge their economy on China's trade. No, their perception will not change. You will still neglect rights of individuals on the ground. You will still be funding countries that are oppressive and causing individuals to submit their rights. You don't remove all these things. Stop making the link, the point at which we cut our ties with North Korea. All the other international community is going to accept us, because behind that, we already commit far more human rights abuses to other nations, and we support far more countries in terms of unconditional manners. So the moral position is not that we are great. We are not changing. If anything, we are only changing for the betterment of the economy. And our position is that unconditional aid is the utmost priority at that point, and unconditional trade is the utmost priority at that point. At this point, government needs to prove to us how China is going to remove all these other abuses. They aren't increasing freedoms of expression within these areas. Sit down. So let's talk about freedoms of expression, right? Because they tried to contend that as well. This is why it was funny. Because apparently China is giving its own citizens more ability to express themselves as to the ruling government within this area. Sure, with a journalist in his plane going missing, with another head of oppositional newsreader being stabbed multiple times, to which the government said they had no comment. I'm pretty sure China is being more transparent and allowing freedoms of expression within this area. What is the conclusion to this issue? A removal of ties from North Korea does not guarantee a morally clean record for China. It does not guarantee cooperation with other nations. If the main reason why other corporations did not want to have ties was that morality, you cannot guarantee that moral name that grants us that trade. Second question, what about economic development? Their claim is that China should not be complicit in the harms to be isolated, because apparently they're being isolated more and more. But wait, your prime minister was the one that told us China has AIIB with other nations that individuals in Europe are continuously opting into because of the unconditional aid. People don't care about China being a horrible nation. They just want imports. Europe's highest importer and exporter is China, guys. It just goes to prove that we don't place an importance on that morality, and China isn't becoming isolated. There are various number one exporters and importers to foreign nations, including Europe. So it's a lie, and stop lying by telling us that they're being isolated by other nations. They have numerous trades with Europe and Asian countries. Secondly, will this really change anything? The point at which you cut ties with North Korea, the only thing you lose is a 6.28 million industry that you said yourself in terms of military and finance and jobs. We think this is the industry that we need to prioritize, given we cannot guarantee a moral position to continue trading with other nations that apparently value that morality. Economic development is guaranteed with North Korea. We don't think that they're going to become better anytime soon. Thirdly, what about the perceptions of China? Sure.
We told you that there's a progressive action of China taking a stand against North Korea that led to the burgeoning economic development that you are talking about. Can you tell me why people want to be interested in engaging in trade with China, given that there is a presumption that the money could be utilized in forwarding North Korea's causes?
Okay, under here, right? So what about the perceptions of China? The first one, the hydrogen bomb thing. Apparently it pissed China off, but not enough to cut ties with North Korea. This is an important understanding in the actions of belligerent nations that does not affect China's trade within them. China prioritizes economic development over it. Let's talk about the UN sanction and support, because apparently that PUI was just basically illustrating they were moving more and more towards hating North Korea. I agree, we do hate North Korea, but China does not cut ties with North Korea, even though it hates it, because it benefits economically from trade and relations all together. What is the example? It's a lie to say that they supported intervention within North Korea. They only supported economic sanctions within North Korea, and let me tell you the difference. The extent of economic sanctions was only inspections on exports and imports going in and out of North Korea to ensure that they didn't have harmed trade with North Korea, guys. It was only to ensure the safety of all countries involved. The extent of your sanctions, which you yourself don't know, is only to check and ensure safety of all investors and exporters at that point in time. Even China has a stake in allowing this sanction to exist, because it also ensures safety, and when it imports its own products from North Korea as well. It is not okay with a resolution to intervene in North Korea. It is okay with a resolution to mitigate the harms of their trade relation in terms of safety when it comes to those inspections in sanctions. The last one, Russia and China. This one was important. They told us we could cut ties with Russia, trying to lie about that as well. We haven't cut ties with Russia, and we cannot. Tsai government has taken the burden upon defending China that is going to be isolated even more to the corner, because the countries that supported unconditional trade will now abandon them as well.
Thank the speaker for his speech. To solve the case of the government bench, I invite the government.
It's very simple from the proposition. If we can prove to you that China has an interest in not being aligned or not being perceived to be complicit with North Korea then it is legitimate for us to make sure that they cut ties with North Korea. Given that, ladies and gentlemen, let's recognize one thing from the opposition bench as of now. If you really listen to it, at no point in the argumentation did they actually tell us that a lot of the benefits that we are fighting for, which is the economic interest that China will get, is predicated or is because of the relation of China with North Korea as well. All they're saying and all they're telling us is, well, why would you want to disalign yourself from North Korea, really? Like, there's no harm that would come from it. And then that's where the argument ends. All they said are a bunch of examples that show that China is still economically prosperous, and that's it. No attachment with any benefits from North Korea whatsoever, and that is abhorrent. I will answer one key question with 3 parts within it. Ultimately, it comes down to what is China's best interest under 3 different areas. Let's first of all look at the priorities and the end goals of China. Let's understand that China right now has grown and also has developed to become an economic powerhouse throughout the world. But more importantly, and they concede to this, but more importantly, we also have to understand that they are also revolutionizing the way in which they took their stances in making sure that they garner that economic growth. That's a good example to show that Xi Jinping have always been publicly expressive with how China is now derailing from being a militarized government, from being a communist government. This establishes one thing and one thing only. China realizes that in order to maximize their ability to get economic benefits from trades with as many countries as possible, they need to be friendly and they need to be seen as friendly. Any likelihood or any probability of that being derailed, then it is against the interest of China, and therefore it is against the interest for them to align themselves with North Korea. So then the question then comes, right? Why exactly would aligning themselves with North Korea be a bad thing? Here's the thing that the opposition bench did not understand whatsoever. There has been numerous trends in the international community today that any signs of complicity is a sign of a probability that you will not be aligned with or you will not be traded with. There's a reason why, no, thank you, sir. There's a reason why Russia, for example, have been heavily demonized within the international community and show very little signs of any countries wanting to trade with them because of their alliances with Syria, because of the kind of aid that they gave to Syria. This establishes one rule within international relation as a principle that if you show signs of, for example, the money that I give you as a country being funneled into something that I am either morally against or I am either economically against, then I have very little interest in wanting to trade with you. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, the second reason also, as opposed to money that I give will be funneled to something that I don't like, is also knowing that if I trade with you, I empower you. And if I empower you, I increase the probability of you vetoing against something that is within my interest, or that is something that I would not want to be vetoed at all. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, people have huge problems whenever China vetoes anything within the United Nations Security Council that is in for the interest of North Korea. The logic that most countries would apply then is if I were to give them more money or if I were to continuously trade with them at any point in the future, then I'll further empower them with the not only legitimacy but also with the ability to be able to veto these very things. No, thank you. They gave us an example and a trend showing that, oh well, people are still trading with China. Fine, we agree that there is a gray area behind countries trading with China still. But the fact still remains that China's best interest is to not just simply make sure that, oh, as long as some people are trading with us, we're good to go. That's not the case. The interest that China has always taken upon themselves is making sure that they maximize the probability that they have in maintaining trade and also looking at comparing both worlds and both paradigms in making sure which of those worlds will maximize my economic opportunity. Fine, maybe China was part of the AIIB, but the problem is it's not as lucrative as if you were to be aligned with the TPPA, for example, which China was not part of, primarily because people just generally at that point don't want to associate or give more money to China anyway, ladies and gentlemen, because of the kinds of relation, because of the kinds of stances that they would have taken. fine. Maybe people may have noted that they are getting less militarized, that they are getting less communistic, but at the same time, people understand that there is still cons in me trading with them because of the way they align themselves with North Korea, because of the money that I would be giving to them and then would be funneled into North Korea. That is a huge problem, and we think that that is against the interest of China. Yes, Kishan.
Recognize and engage the analysis about countries supporting China and having trade due to the unconditional aid because they have their own interests and they have their own injustices that they need to cover up.
Okay, maybe there are countries that have interests against them that they may not want to cover up. But the issue here at the same time is that there are still countries that would still show probability of not wanting to trade with China. It's not an absolute. As long as we can prove to you that there are countries trading with China, it immediately means that it's against the interests of China. The interest of China has always been to just simply maximize the probability. If you can tell us at any point that no country will be, that you can tell us that there will be country who will be okay, or there will be country that will be fine with China still aligning themselves with North Korea, then fine, we lose the debate. But the point is, we can still show signs that countries still have stances against North Korea, which would then correlate and logically deduce the fact that they have, at the very least, intuitions and also probabilities in making sure that they don't want to trade with China because of the money that will have gone to China, or empowering China in making vetoes in the United Nations Security Council, which would have been problematic. Then let's illustrate the kind of consequences that China simply does not want, right? Because they said that, well, at the same time, China doesn't necessarily care about perception. Therefore, they don't really care about moral duties that that they impose on themselves in trading with in trading with whoever they want. Then we've already showed you through our analysis that trends have already established the fact that China is not going to a direction that is simply friendly in nature. The fact that these trends happen, the public statements that were made by Xi Jinping, the very recent veto that China finally made to North Korea, as well as making sure that they generally publicly decry themselves from being aligned with North Korea, establishes that a stance that China has made has always been to make friends and has always been for the interest of the benefit of making those friends. If we can prove that they have that interest in doing so, we won the debate.
Thanks, Speaker, for speech. There's no case for the opposition bench.
Malaysia's had a moral stance against North Korea, but they're still very strong allies with China. When the US wanted to instigate the TPPA, they did so in isolation of China. All of these things prove to you that countries don't necessarily make economic decisions, based on ideological differences or similarities. It's all about how much this particular country can profit to you, which means to say every example they've given to you, right? The IIB, or the fact that, China, it has still a burgeoning economy, even though they've still had ties with North Korea, show you that no matter what it is, China needs to focus on its economic prowess and not try to bow to whatever moral clauses your side believes are important to them, right? I'll just prove those in two questions. First of all, are we better able to foster ties with the US and the West in the event that we go with their policy? And the second question, what happens to China's regional influence in the part of Asia, right? So first question, are they more likely to foster ties with the US and the West? What they argue to us very simplistically is this, that you get more development because obviously now the investment that goes to China doesn't go to North Korea, and everyone loves being moral. But here's the thing, in several POIs, they told us a few things, right? First of all, that, but China's expression of some kind of lack of support, them vetoing a little bit of something to North Korea, means they have a burgeoning economy, right? What does this mean? It means, like, first of all, that their examples have only proven that China is a selfish country, right? Because all their examples are about how much China benefited from those things. So that means the only time when China will ever go against North Korea is in the event it benefits them economically. Why do we say that that's not true? Sit down. It's because you've had your burgeoning economy all this while, right? People haven't given much of a people haven't cared that much about North Korea being on their side. Because the thing is this, right? China's greatest strength is that they are an economic power, that they have a huge market, that they're giving you cheap imports, right? And that they're a really, really strong economic ally to have, right? We think that they lose all of those things in the event that they go against North Korea, right? Because why is that? They never understood our argument as to why the hatred for China goes much further than North Korea, right? We think it's an ideological battle between the US and China currently. Both of them are really strong economic powers. Both of them want to consolidate that power. That's why the US goes to TPPA. That's why China goes to IIB, right? All of these things mean that it's really just tokenistic, right? These are issues of morality with China. That's just the way that the US tries to make sure that they have some kind of power there. What's the issue though? China will never be able to win over them with your moral stances. China will always shut down, well, probably for at least the foreseeable future, will probably always shut down on political expression. They will probably still have all these different things that are still criticisms, right? They will still be like, oh, but our money is still going to some kind of negative point. But what's their response to this though? Their response was, all right, we'll just cut ties with Russia. We'll cut ties with these bad allies. We'll try to make ourselves look as good as possible. Here's the thing. That's when you lose all the power that you have, right? Because that's where China's power lies. That's why the US knows that it has to go to TPPA to fight with China, right? Because they have that regional power in hand. Their response in the whip was really sad, saying, oh, Russia's really weak. All the things that they have are nothing, right? But here's the thing. Russia isn't weak at all. They have a regional hegemony in Syria where the US itself is failing, right? We think that they're a lot stronger than you say, right? Cutting ties with Russia that you have a border with and could very well have huge military attacks from, because you have a border share and these are probably violent individuals that you have, means that whatever trade that you might get with the US, which they've never proven, cannot offset these kinds of harms. Because this side was too extreme in talking about who they want to cut ties with. We think ultimately they shot themselves in the foot. Yes.
If it's not about ideological battles or economic development, are you going to say that the way that you prioritize your interests right now must be geographical proximity rather than what is strategic for you comprehensively?
So we think what's strategic comprehensively is making sure you don't pick a fight with North Korea and China that have hydrogen bombs. It's also about making sure you have the best economic power, and that's maintaining your regional influence such that you become so powerful as China that it doesn't matter if you're immoral, because other countries will still trade with you because of that power that you have consolidated. Ultimately, everything that they've said about China wanting to ultimately be good individuals and be moral were false, because everything that they've ever done was for selfish reasons. Their sanctions, their veto that they talked about was only so they could protect themselves from the imports that could have contained something bad from North Korea, right? But let's talk about this second question though, in terms of maintaining regional influence. And here's where they never bothered to respond to us, right? Because what we told you was this: the reason why China is such a big threat, the reason why the US has to fight so hard to make sure that they maintain their 100 years of power, is that China has been able to have a lot of allies within their region, right? Why is that? Even if they may not have ideological similarities, right? So for example, Malaysia does not want anything to do with North Korea, but they're still with China. The difference is this: China offers them unconditional aid, which they love, right? But what's the difference though? In the event that it becomes conditional to North Korea, the logic for their other allies is going to be, if I have to be subject to conditions, if I have to become a moral state and I have to fix my act, why not just go to the US? Because that's what many of them are already, because that's what some of them are already doing by signing that agreement in the TPPA, right? So that means that you lose the only stronghold that you had. The only reason now, right, why China is such a big economic threat is the power that they have within their region, right? That's why everyone wants to be their ally. That's why they don't have to be moral in order to get your trade partners, right? All of those things are lost in the event that you cut your ties with one long-time ally, meaning that all the others also start to do the same, right? But what was the other harm, right, that we talked to you about? We told you that you increase the military threats that are posed against China, right? All they tried to say was that, oh, it's obviously not going to happen. It's not a big deal. We can always do other things, right? But like, hello, the reason why everyone is so afraid of North Korea isn't just because they're rogue, like individually. It's also because of how incredibly volatile they are, right, with the power that they have. Do you honestly think that cutting ties with North Korea, putting yourself in the direct line of fire from their hydrogen bombs, is something that is beneficial to this country? We don't think so. We don't care about your ideals of morality. All we care about is being able to gain economic might. Ultimately, right, the strongest line of argument that they ever had was that the rest of the international community has moral issues with with China, and if we deal with those things, we get more trade from them, we become more powerful. We told you why, first of all, that like trying to become more moral will never ever exist, right? Because it's all a facade to try and consolidate the power of the West against China is never going to happen. But most importantly, doing all these things, right, to try and counter to the US or to your West means that the US gains economic might, right? Which means that they tend to look like a better trade partner for all the allies that China has right now. This means that this is the side that makes your IIB increasingly powerless, because China now does not have the support of all those other allies that they wanted to fix. They never told us why their allies of Malaysia and Myanmar would ever want to stay with China if they already had to undergo with conditional aid, which means they never get the kind of support that they try to argue for you.
Thank you, Speaker, for speech. Then the substantive portion is made again, the reply portion, invite the opposition.
This debate's broken down to 3 questions. Firstly, whether China needs to be moral in order to maintain economic stability. Secondly, will this debate ensure economic morality and an economic moral perception towards China? And thirdly, does North Korea as an ally benefit China in large enough to be sufficient trade-off, even if there's possible harms that we still have not heard from side government? It's important to recognize that in the first question, whether China needs to be moral, the analysis that side government gave us was relatively assertive. They told us trends have shown us that countries are moving away. They've told us trends have shown that there's been a moral criteria in trade relations and in order to establish proper relations with other nations. But at the same time, providing us logical reasoning as to why all these trends are wrong, why countries prioritize their economic sustainability, even if sometimes they do end up funding nuclear research. Malaysia, the EU, we all trade with China, and I don't see how this fits within their trends. We are all in any way complicit in all the harms that North Korea carries out. But at least in the end of the day, Malaysia prioritizes these trades because we are dependent on the exports and imports that we get from them. The same applies to the US as a big trade partner. The same applies to the EU. So I don't see the morality playing an important role in economic trade, as economic trade as an ideology alone is important for countries. And up till this point, countries have been blind to their moral negligence in the harms that happen in various nations. I don't see why China is going to lose, if not why they are already losing economic harms, because apparently they're a powerhouse and they couldn't combat that characterization. Secondly, even if China had an obligation to benefit their moral perception, can they do it? Because we told you, even if it was logical, and we bought the first characterization that China needs to become more moral, we told you it's simply not possible from these actions alone, because this trade-off cannot be premised only off of trading off a 6.2 million industry for the possibility of becoming more moral in the eyes of the international community. Logical reasonings that we haven't heard responses to from side government. We told you the support for Myanmar and the harms that happen in various other nations, all their unconditional trade partners, the violation of human rights and the limitation of freedoms. Why are all these things that your international community is going to be blinded by when they inevitably carry out trade with China? Because apparently the point at which you get rid of Russia and North Korea as a trade partner, all the other things do not become significant. We can ignore human rights abuses. We are still going to trade with China. We don't think so. This is not enough of a trade-off to create any moral perception, even if a moral perception was important in terms of trade. Thirdly, what is the characterization of China in today's world? Because it's important to recognize that government's case was extremely wishy-washy on this. In their prime minister, they tried to establish that China was losing in the global economy. It was being isolated. AIIB was less lucrative in comparison to the TPPA, continued to be contradicted by the other speakers when they told us they're a global powerhouse, a progressive powerhouse that cannot be challenged by other nations. The rest of the world is dependent on their economy, and we require their exports and imports as well. At times of convenience, this side of the house wanted to tell us that AIIB was horrible, but at the same time tell us it was a growing economy and a plan that could save China. The important stance here from our side was important because we told you that China is growing and countries are dependent on China, and the priority of economic interest far outweighs any moral clause that China could have. But secondly, we also told you, Aham, that they did not want to respond to. Countries with social issues within their nations are still likely to support China over the US because it takes a moral clause to join the TPPA for Myanmar and other countries that commit human rights abuses. These are all traits that the US will not subscribe to, but China benefits largely off of. They did not want to respond to it. The only response was, if you could name a country, then we lose the debate, right? The last part of this is, does this benefit China? The only reasoning we heard here was, North Korea does not benefit China. From the first and the very get-go, we told you that it benefits them militarily and financially, the industry that they named to us themselves, that they wanted to trade off. If they wanted to trade this off, they needed to prove why these trends could help us establish more trade partners than we already have.
Thank you, Speaker, for the speech. Close the case for number bench to end the roll.
It is a naive presumption on opposition that the global political framework of international relations is an absolute binary. If you win one here, you do not need to engage there. If you have allies here, you do not need to care about everyone else, ladies and gentlemen. That is why proposition in this debate never took on a moral presupposition of what China is supposed to be, but how do you best maintain perception in the eyes of the international community, and how do you best manage that perception is to be strategic in what you would like to engage upon, and we think that also includes who you ally yourself with. Because we think, independent of whether China is moral or not, there is a presumption that exists in status quo that they aren't, that they are devil. There are static characterizations tagged upon China of being the devil or being a communist state that is complicit in blood money to North Korea. And we think that we need to break that, ladies and gentlemen. This debate is an evaluation of what is strategic for China. Let's look at the two premises opposition relied their debate on. One, that China are bad people, we are immoral, and therefore we shouldn't do anything. Number two, economic development already exists. I don't think in any way they were able to show the convergence between these two premises with continuously aligning ourselves directly with North Korea. In fact, the only analysis they would like to make is that North Korea is volatile in nature and that's problematic. I think that presupposition is buttressed by the fact that China has a 6.2 billion economy industry with North Korea, and that's the way in which the entirety of the world perceives. I am deeply sad or offended that ops level of engagement is this way, to call ourselves liars and then to note examples, to disprove examples, and then leading to a conclusion that China has no responsibility. I'm going to be fair, and let's assume by not considering all examples to be true, let's then make the comparison. We think that at some point, economic development and political will have to intersect in order to ensure your best strategy in your country. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. China's economic development over the last decade became a lot better because China actively tried to distance itself from things like militarization or extreme communism or relying itself with its allies, ladies and gentlemen. That's why things like the Xi Jinping coming forward and actively attacking the extreme militarization was important. That is why China taking a position of rejecting the accepting the United Nations Security Resolution was important to indicate our behavior right now. If it is tokenistic in nature, we will take that, ladies and gentlemen, because in the eyes of the international community, that still means something. Secondly, let's look at morality, because I don't think this is contentious, but that's the largest point they had, right? And I told you that right now, if it was about playing a moral actor, ladies and gentlemen, we think that at this point, people already prejudge China to begin with, but we think that they can't, because every country will have issues at some point, ladies and gentlemen. And acknowledging that every country may have problems relating to democracy or the treatment of people, we think what is best right now is to look at the methods in which we try to rectify that perception and what is most strategic. And we think that China took a position of trying to engage in economic development because it's relatable across different countries, irrespective of what your ideologies are. That's why we told you this is not about an ideological battle, rather a strategic management in terms of economic development that is independent from moral characterization. Lastly, on relationships, right? Let's break it down. We told you from outside of the house, economic relationships and political relationships are different in nature, and you need both in order for you to be a global superpower. That's why we told you instances of isolation that China may face is right now exacerbated by the fact that political relations are also important, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that once you do this, at least what you do is you temper political conflicts that can necessarily arise between the United States and China, for example. But it also removes the static characterizations in the way in which people view China, and we think that's important, right? The difference between Asian countries and North Korea is the scale of threat that North Korea is able to levy upon you, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that right now, if China wants to present itself as a tiger of Asia, as a global superpower, and trying to fight off any United States influence like they say China really wants, we think that at this point, it is just unstrategic for you to present yourself to being held at ransom by a tiny state led by a puny man with daddy issues, very proud to propose.
Thank you for the debate. We'll stop for shake hands.
Yes.